Hi, I'm Robin Atilano de los Reyes, a faculty from the Ateneo de Zamboanga University, Philippines. Today, allow me to share with you my paper titled Multilingual Mindanao, Evidence from Elementary Classrooms in Zamboanga City. For those of you who are not familiar with Philippine geography, Mindanao is the southern part of the Philippines. In fact, islands of Sulu and Tawi-Tawi are much closer to Malaysia than to Manila. Mindanao, or collectively called Southern Philippines to include the island group, is home to more than 50 languages and dialects. Whereas the Mindanao languages belong to Austronesian family of languages, specifically the Malayo-Polynesian languages with the exception of Chabacano, each group has developed a distinct vernacular as a result of its isolation from others and later its contact with particular groups either in the form of trading, migration, and colonization. Thus, Mindanao is considered as the most linguistically diverse island in the Philippines. And such multilingual reality is further evidenced by the Mindanao people's language practices such as translanguaging, code switching, borrowing, and translation, which are also common among other multilingual people in the world. Accordingly, in multilingual communities such as Mindanao, where language diversity is a norm, people are always open to negotiating diverse languages in their everyday public life. These people consider negotiating different languages as part of their lives and anticipate meeting people who speak different languages. Whenever they communicate with an individual with a different language, they and the other party start interacting using their own preferred codes instead of finding a common language. In other words, in a multilingual interaction, the norms are hybrid and accommodative to the different languages people bring to the interaction. This hybridity in the use of languages may come in the form of the language practices. Translation here refers to the rendering of the meaning of a given linguistic discourse from one language to another as shown in the example here. Borrowing, on the other hand, refers to the use of individual words originating from a language which serves as a donor language to another language, which is the recipient language. While a borrowed word may be used in its actual form and integrate in sentence structure of the recipient language, much like intrasentential code switching, this paper distinguishes borrowing from code switching by limiting it to the practice of invariably using a borrowed word in a conjugated form following the word formation processes of the recipient language, as shown in the given example. In code switching, the speaker or speakers switches between two or more different language codes during a single stretch of discourse. This is according to Afring and Tail in 2005. This can occur in two ways: within a sentence termed as intrasentential code switching, where a sentence contains elements from two or more languages, and within a group of sentences or a paragraph, termed as intersentential code switching, where a group of sentences include sentences or clauses from two or more languages. Translanguaging, since it was first introduced by Williams in 1994, has been variedly theorized. Baker in 2003 referred to it as the pedagogical practices where students hear or read a lesson, a passage in a book, or a section of text in one language and develop their work in another. Garcia in 2009 argued that it is the bilinguals' flexible use of their linguistic resources to make meaning of their lives and their complex worlds. Moreover, Kanagaraja in 2011 intimated that it is the ability of multilingual speakers to shuttle between languages, treating the diverse languages that form the repertoire as an integrated system. In this paper, Translanguaging concurs to Kanagaraj's view and prefers that through such language practice, multilinguals like the Mindanaoans enjoy some flexibility in their deployment of languages in their repertoire. The data gathered for this study are thus analyzed in relation to these practices. The paper argues that the manifestations of these practices in the selected classrooms can further ascertain the multilingual reality in Mindanao, and subsequently prefers that these practices should be allowed to be used in the classrooms to the benefit of both teachers and students. Since the study focuses on multilingual teachers and students' use of language practices in the classrooms, the data was gathered from selected classrooms in one of the multilingual cities in Mindanao, that is Zamboanga City. With the more than 10 languages present in the city and an average resident speaks at least 3 languages, the city exhibits both societal and individual multilingualism. See way for further discussion. And as the economic hub in the western part of Mindanao, Philippines, Zamboanga City has become a ground for the commingling of people from various linguistic backgrounds in the region. With this backdrop, it is instructive to examine the language practices bred in the city, as these can provide insights into the multilingual reality in Mindanao. Thus, the study looks into the language practices of Zamboangueños, more specifically of the teachers and the students in the teaching and learning of English as an additional language in elementary classrooms. Using non-participatory observation, and the data was gathered from 2 third-grade classes covering 3 lessons for each class. The classes were chosen based on the following criteria. It's third-grade class, it's an ESL class, and with students from at least 3 of the ethno-linguistic groups in the city. All observations were recorded and transcribed using the Vienna-Oxford International Corpus of English Markup Conventions. The transcript of each observation was presented in terms of utterance following Bakhtin's 1986 view of utterance as a response to preceding utterances of the given sphere, where response is understood in the broadest sense, and Levinson's notion of turn as a time during which a single participant speaks within a typical orderly arrangement in which participants speak with minimal overlap and gap between them. Thus, in the observed classroom interactions for this paper, each turn by a speaker either in the form of spoken or written word or group of words, or action that was meant to respond to a previous spoken or written word or group of words or action, was considered as an utterance. The utterances were then analyzed to determine the language practices used for a particular communicative function, which relates to Savignon's notion of language function as the use to which language is put the purpose of an utterance rather than the particular grammatical form an utterance takes. Analysis reveals that the teachers and the students use multilingual language practices to accomplish the following communicative functions: discussing meaning of a word or a concept, discussing a text such as poem, story, graph, or giving instructions, managing behaviors, and instilling values. In the elementary classrooms, discussing the meaning of a certain word or a concept is common. This was also observed in the data gathered, and teachers and students in the selected classrooms indicated to have done this using language practices like translanguaging, borrowing, code switching, and translation. Notice that while the subject was ESL, some of the topics discussed were related to science, as these classes also focus on the everyday experiences of the students. Consider, for example, this excerpt. In here, the teacher used translanguaging with features of English, Filipino, and Chabacano to discuss the concept of pollution as contributed by cars. As this was in an ESL class, the teacher mainly used English. However, she used features of local languages to emphasize something, such as diba or kosa. Diba is in Filipino and kosa is in Chabacano. Seemingly, in multilingual classrooms, not only do the teachers practice such translanguaging and translation to discuss the meaning of a word, they also encourage their students to do the same, such as in this excerpt. The teacher was clearly encouraging her students to express their understanding of the meaning of a word in the languages they were more familiar with. In fact, when the students respond to the teacher's questions in the target language, the teacher would provide the translation herself, seemingly as a way to deepen students' understanding of the meaning of a word as shown in this excerpt. Okay, for example, here, what do you mean by ugly, not good to see? And the teacher translated it to akel bien pangit using features from Chabacano and Filipino. In elementary classrooms, it is also common for teachers to introduce a reading text, such as a story or a poem. And whenever they do so, they try to facilitate their students' understanding of a text by asking questions and discussing its elements. From the data gathered, it could be observed that the teachers did so by using certain language practices. And in turn, the students participated in such activity by using also their language practices. For example, in excerpt 4, the teacher asked a question to elicit students' schema of the word future found in the title, and she did so by using Filipino, although the rest of her utterance was in English. While the teacher seemed keen on using English during her English class, she would occasionally shift to other languages like Filipino and Chabacano, as shown in this excerpt. In excerpt 5, you will see that while the teacher predominantly used English in the lesson, she would also use other languages like Filipino to ask questions in order to engage students in the discussion. In excerpt 6, such is also observed. For both teachers, it could be observed that they usually use translanguaging during the times when they did not get immediate responses from their students. Okay. Other than discussing a concept or a, a topic or discussing a text, the teachers were also used and the students were also observed to have used language practices in giving instructions. Generally, compared to teachers in the secondary and tertiary levels, those in the elementary level spend more time for this particular communicative function. In the data gathered, not only teachers spend time repeating the instructions and presenting this slowly and discreetly, but they also use language practices to ensure that their instructions are understood. Take this excerpt for example. In here, while the teacher used English for the most part to give instructions, she subsequently used translanguage utterances with English and Chabacano features to further clarify her instructions. Seemingly, the multilingual students are able to benefit more from instructions, especially the complicated ones if delivered using translanguaging. In fact, when instructions were given in English only, as you would see here, okay, these seem not immediately clear and adequate. So in such case, students would end up asking questions even for very simple instructions, such as how to answer, even the manner of just answering the exercise. Consequently, teachers would use language practices such as translanguaging and borrowing as shown in these excerpts. Mag-copy, i-pencil. Note, however, that borrowing is likely to happen when the utterances are mainly in a local language, and the borrowed word is from English. And so that word now is conjugated following the uh, conjugation system of the local language. Use of translanguaging in giving instructions is also said to be common in multilingual classrooms, such as in the study of Eslit, Atkinson, Lucas and Katz, Makarov, Cook, and Kosa. Additionally, at times, the students would deliberately ask their teachers to translate the instructions or items they would work on, as shown in this excerpt. Ma'am, asa daw translate na number 6? Ma'am, could you translate number 6? Suggesting that translation is also helpful for the students to understand the instruction. Now, another communicative function observed in which the language practices were used is managing behaviors. Probably teachers in the elementary levels face the greatest difficulty in managing students' behaviors as they have to do so without incurring the slightest physical or verbal abuses. With this, teachers' use of language practice or language itself is seen crucial. They need to choose the right language, quote and unquote, that will create effective and efficient classroom management. In the data gathered, the teachers manage their students' behaviors not by using a certain language, but the language practices as shown in this excerpt. So you have, it's a combination of features from English, Tagalog, and Chabacano, or Filipino, or and Chabacano. The teacher mixed her utterances with demonstratives in Filipino like dito, John, and doon when instructing students to behave and to facilitate the conduct of group work. Seemingly, such practice provides her instructions some force, compelling students to respond immediately. Additionally, T1's use of the Filipino word muna, loosely translated as first, make her translanguage utterance more empathic. Such practice also concurs the finding on the beneficial use of learners' languages and language practices in accommodating cooperation among learners, such as by Atkinson in 1987, Anton and Di Camila in 1998, Shamash in 1990, Lucas and Katz in 1994, Macaro 1997, Cook 2001, Deller and Rinvo Lucri 2002, and Critchley in 2002. And lastly, the communicative function of instilling values. One of the concerns of education is instilling values among students, especially in the elementary levels. From the data gathered, teachers were observed to have attempted instilling the values of sharing and of caring for environment using their language practices. Consider the excerpts here. The teacher also exhibited the linguistic behavior of assessing the more familiar term, which is accessing the more familiar term, which is common not only among bilinguals, but also among multilinguals. The teacher used the word color instead of Crayola, okay? Instead of Crayola, which is the equivalent in Filipino. Sino pa ang walang color dito? Okay? Note that the use of the word color in the said questions seems to be an appropriation as it is not the word for the coloring material, which is crayon, but the word for the effect of using the material. When what the function of the word color here is supposed to be a noun referring to the crayons. Okay? In this excerpt, the teacher expressed appreciation of the child's desire to have a garden, and subsequently, which is a character in the text that they read, and subsequently encouraged her students to do the same using translanguaging with features of Chabacano and English. Notice that the utterance was mainly in Chabacano, o bueno paele, maskin child, le quiere leche ne garden. But the content words child and garden were in English. Seemingly, keeping those two words in English was her way of connecting to a student's previous response. But the expression of appreciation was done in translanguaging, which seems to be intentional as the said practice allows one language to stay connected to the flow of discussion, while the other to encourage values that can directly affect the receiver, no, given that it is a feature from their very own language. So to conclude, as teachers and students involved in this paper manifested use of language practices inherent in their being multilinguals, this paper prefers that these practices are their ways of maximizing their multilingual resources. More specifically, through their language practices, they were able to accomplish the communicative functions necessary to perform their roles as teachers and students in the ESL classroom. It is important to note that while the practices here were delineated into translanguaging, code switching, borrowing, and translation, using insights from current literature, the paper intimates that these practices can be subsumed under translanguaging following the article of De Los Reyes published in 2019. With the above instantiations of the use of language practices among the teachers and the students in multilingual classrooms, which are common in many areas in Mindanao as cradles of different languages, similar practices may be observed among those in other parts in the region. Thus, the study extends the participants' use of language practices as reflective of the multilingual reality not only in Zamboanga City, but also in many parts of Mindanao. Moreover, the study posits that understanding such linguistic reality of Mindanao is helpful in developing more effective programs that seek to improve instruction in Mindanao. For instance, this paper argues that it is through purposeful accommodation of students' languages and language practices that the mother tongue-based multilingual education can help multilingual students succeed in English classrooms, especially in accomplishing their communicative functions that are helpful in learning English. More importantly, language practices such as translanguaging allow, and I quote, students to learn another language while at the same time to maintain the languages that they already possess, De Los Reyes 2018, end of quote. In other words, linguistically, multilingual learners in Mindanao stand only to gain when their multilingual identity is taken into account in teaching and learning. So that's the end. Here are my references. Okay, and I would like to end by saying thank you in some of the languages in the city. Muchas gracias, magsukul, daghang salamat, maraming salamat, thank you.